He founded Drawn&Quarterly in 1989 and oversaw its growth from a limited edition zine to a world-renowned comics and graphic novel publisher. Please give it up for Chris Oliveros.
For our silver anniversary, we published an 800-page anthology, and it features virtually every major cartoonist we've published over the last 2.5 decades. It's kind of a big deal, but it's always important to remember that we had really humble beginnings, not just for 1 year or 2 years, but for about a dozen or so years. The company was run out of various incarnations of my apartment, mostly located in Mile End. It would be very difficult to give any talk on graphic novels without first mentioning this book over here, which is Mouse, the Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Art Spiegelman. There was really nothing else out there like what Art Spiegelman was doing in tone and content and the approach and, of course, the subject matter. The book is about his parents' survival of the Holocaust. So when Drawn&Quarterly started publishing in the early 90s, we got off on the right foot pretty fast in terms of publishing a lot of really talented cartoonists, including people like Chester Brown, Julie Doucet, Adrian Tomine, Seth. Here's an example of one of Seth's major books, It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken. It's a book that the editors of the Comics Journal cited as being one of the 100 top books of the 20th century. In 2013, Drawn&Quarterly published Chester Brown's groundbreaking historical graphic novel, Louis Riel. This is a book that actually really changed the way comics were perceived in Canada in particular. Before this book came out, if you were in Canada, it was really hard to find graphic novels. You actually kind of had to be in the know. You had to sort of know which comic store to go to. It had to be the right one because most comic stores didn't carry this type of material. So if you actually were lucky enough to find this in the bookstore, it usually would be misfiled in the science fiction section. Chester Brown's next book, following Louis Riel, couldn't have been more different from in subject matter. This book, Paying for It, was actually a book, it was an autobiographical book about Chester's sex life, but in particular about his experiences with prostitutes. Guy Delisle, the author of Pyongyang, is probably one of the foremost practitioners of what I guess you could call the political graphic novel. The IS series is a semi-fictionalized account of a group of young women growing up in the Ivory Coast circa the late 1970s. The book is largely based on the experiences of the writer of this book, Marguerite Aboué. One of her goals with this book is that she wanted to tell a different, kind of a different story of an African country. And sadly, I mean, whenever we do read about Africa, it's usually a tragedy involved. For several years now, Drawn&Quarterly has been publishing some really major Japanese cartoonists. This book over here is by an author named Yoshihiro Tatsumi. It was an 840-page memoir of his life. Next to this guy, Mizuki, Tatsumi was practically a young whippersnapper. Shigeru Mizuki is actually still alive. He's 93 years old. He is like a cultural icon in Japan. He's like really one of the most famous cultural figures in Japan. There's streets named after him. There's statues on this street. This is a book about his childhood growing up in 1930s Japan. Imagine that, 1930s, and he's still alive and working. One of Finland's great cultural exports is the Moomin series by the great writer, artist, painter, and cartoonist Tove Jansson. Few people at the time realized that she wrote and drew a Moomin comic strip in the 1950s. The series of books went on to become really popular. One of the most successful comics in recent years is Hark a Vagrant. Kate Beaton literally came out of almost nowhere in 2007 when she started her own website. Within about a year or a year and a half, she just developed this massive following. There's like so many different approaches you could take with graphic novels, and that's something that's always like fascinated me, intrigued me about it. In the very first publication of Drawn&Quarterly, I wrote a brief editorial kind of lamenting the fact that there were very few women reading this or creating these comics. I was saying that it was kind of like a private boys' club. Well, Miriam Caton kind of represents how far we've come in the 2.5 decades since then. She's 72 years old, and she just started doing graphic novels in the last 10 years. So Tom Gauld, he's a really well-known cartoonist in London, England. He does work for The Guardian. Michael DeForge, he's a good example of this, sort of one of these new talents. He's a guy that's really developed his own visual style. Like, you kind of can recognize when somebody is so unique when you can't quite place the people who've come before them. A lot of the really good artists have actually come from Quebec. For example, Chester Brown, who I was talking about earlier on, Guy Delisle grew up in Quebec City. This person over here, Pascal Girard, grew up in Jonquière, Quebec. And he's actually a good example of quite a few cartoonists that we work with, in that he writes first in French. He'll often get it published by a French publisher, either in Quebec or in France. And then Drawn&Quarterly will have it translated for the English market. Sylvie is like a real pioneer, not just in Quebec or Canada, but really internationally in graphic novels, in the sense that she's one of the first people, after maybe Crumb, to do autobiographical comics. She actually worked in strip clubs, and she wanted to document this whole process. So she made her own comic books, her own zines, and she would photocopy them and sell it to the patrons in these strip clubs. There's a very stark juxtaposition here that she has this kind of this sweet, innocent drawing style that she's drawing about, the strip clubs and, drug dealers and so on. In 2007, we had this crazy idea. That we wanted to open up a bookstore. We found that there wasn't really, the right places here for our books in the city. We couldn't really hold launches for our events here. So we thought, okay, let's try opening up a bookstore where, hopefully it won't bankrupt the company. And it ended up being quite successful. It didn't bankrupt us. It actually ended up, aside from carrying Drawn&Quarterly books, obviously it carries many comics that we like. It has a fairly strong curated literature section, art and design, children's books, YA books, French and English books. It's also kind of become a community hub. We host a lot of events. From small presses to large, well-known authors. There's been a few changes. After 25 years, I've stepped down as publisher, and Peggy Burns, who has done incredible work with Drawn&Quarterly over the last dozen years. She's really been one of the main factors in the growth of the company. She has been promoted to a publisher role, and I'll be taking on a much smaller role in the company. So that's the history of 25 years in 25 minutes.